The escape pod screamed through the atmosphere of Kepler 442b like a falling star, its hull glowing white-hot from atmospheric friction. Inside the cramped compartment, Dr. Sarah Chen gripped the emergency restraints as the world spun violently around her. Warning lights painted her face in alternating shades of red and amber, while the pod's computer announced in mechanical tones that structural integrity was failing. 3 days ago, she had been aboard the research vessel Prometheus, humanity's first deep space exploration ship, cataloging mineral compositions in the Kepler system. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been whether her xenogeology samples would survive the journey back to Earth. Now, as her pod carved a burning trail across an alien sky, survival had taken on an entirely different meaning. The impact came without warning. One moment she was falling through clouds that glowed with bioluminescent particles, and the next, the pod was carving a furrow through crystalline sand that sparkled like ground diamonds. When the emergency systems finally stopped their urgent beeping and the world stopped moving, Sarah found herself hanging upside down in a universe that had suddenly become very quiet. She released the restraints and dropped to what was now the ceiling, her hands shaking as adrenaline coursed through her system. The pod's main display flickered weakly, showing critical system failures across every major component. Life support was running on emergency power and would last maybe 6 hours. The communications array had been completely destroyed in the crash. Sarah activated the emergency release and the pod's hatch hissed open, revealing an alien landscape that took her breath away. The sky was a deep purple, crossed by 2 moons that hung like silver coins against the cosmic tapestry. The sand beneath her feet was indeed crystalline, each grain catching and refracting the strange light into tiny rainbows. In the distance, massive spires of what looked like living coral stretched toward the heavens, pulsing with soft bioluminescent patterns. She had landed on an inhabited world. The realization hit her as she noticed the geometric patterns in the coral formations, the way they seemed to form deliberate clusters and networks. This wasn't just life, this was civilization. And according to the Prometheus's final sensor readings before the accident, this system was supposed to be uninhabited. Sarah retrieved the emergency survival kit from the pod, a compact unit containing basic medical supplies, a water recycler, emergency rations for 2 weeks, and a beacon transmitter that might, if she was extraordinarily lucky, reach any passing ships. She also grabbed her personal tablet, which contained her research data, and more importantly, every piece of information humanity had gathered about potential alien contact protocols. As she stood beside her ruined escape pod, looking out over an alien landscape, the magnitude of her situation began to settle in. She wasn't just stranded on an alien world, she might be humanity's first contact with an intelligent alien species. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. The first sign that she wasn't alone came an hour after the crash, as she was attempting to boost the signal strength of her emergency beacon. The crystalline sand around her pod began to vibrate with a low, rhythmic humming. Sarah looked up from her work to see a group of figures approaching across the crystal flats. They moved with purpose, not the random wandering of curious animals, and as they drew closer, Sarah could make out their forms more clearly. They were roughly humanoid but taller, perhaps 7 feet in height, with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to shift color like a chameleon's. Each wore what appeared to be form-fitting armor that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns as the coral spires. Sarah stood slowly, her hands visible and empty, remembering the first rule of xenocontact: appear non-threatening. The beings stopped about 50 feet away and began what appeared to be a discussion among themselves, their voices creating harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing. Then something extraordinary happened. Above each of the alien beings, a translucent blue hologram materialized, displaying what appeared to be information in a script that shifted and flowed like living calligraphy. Sarah watched in fascination as the symbols changed and rearranged themselves, clearly some kind of technological interface. One of the beings approached her alone, and as it drew closer, a similar hologram appeared above Sarah's head. But instead of the flowing script, her display showed only harsh red symbols that seemed to flash urgently. The alien stopped abruptly, its head tilting in what might have been confusion or concern. The being spoke, its voice creating harmonics that Sarah felt in her bones. To her amazement, the sounds slowly transformed into words she could understand, as if some universal translator was parsing the language in real time. "The system recognizes you as sentient," the being said, its voice carrying musical undertones. "But it cannot classify your nature. This is unprecedented." The alien's skin shifted through several color patterns that seemed to indicate agitation or confusion. "You register as Earthborn, classification unknown." Such a designation should not exist. Sarah found her voice, hoping that whatever translation technology was at work functioned both ways. I'm human. My name is Sarah Chen. My ship crashed here. I mean no harm to you or your people. The being's skin shifted to what might have been surprise. Human. This word is not in the Coalition databases. Your planet of origin? Earth. It's very far from here. We've never encountered other intelligent life before now. The conversation that followed changed everything Sarah thought she knew about the universe. The being, who introduced himself as Keeper Voss of the Crystalline Collective, explained that she had crash-landed on a world within the territory of something called the Galactic Coalition, a vast interstellar government that had existed for thousands of years and encompassed hundreds of species. Every sentient being in known space, Voss explained, was classified by the system, a technological network that had evolved beyond its original programming to become something approaching artificial intelligence. The system measured everything: combat capability, psychic potential, technological aptitude, biological advantages. It determined not just how beings were categorized, but their rights, their opportunities, even their value in coalition society. A being classified as those with psionic Mondri's council even join the Mindari Council. Even classifications grant basic rights and protection. But you... He paused, his patterns becoming uncertain. The system cannot parse your nature. In 3,000 years, this has never occurred. Sarah absorbed this information with growing unease. A society that classified people based on predetermined categories, that assigned value and opportunity based on biological or technological measurements, it sounded disturbingly familiar from Earth's own history. What happens to unclassified beings? She asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. Voss's skin patterns darkened. There are no unclassified beings. The system accounts for all known sentient life. Those who cannot be classified. He paused again, clearly struggling with the concept. The protocols are unclear. This situation has never existed. Before Sarah could respond, the air around them filled with a new harmonic, deeper, more aggressive than Voss's musical tones. The other members of his group shifted into what was clearly a defensive formation, their armor patterns accelerating to rapid warning flashes. A new group was approaching across the Crystal Flats, and these beings moved very differently from Voss's people. Where the Crystalline Collective moved with fluid grace, these newcomers marched with military precision. Their armor was darker, more angular, and the weapons they carried looked distinctly lethal. "Zephyrian warriors," Voss said, his voice tight with tension. "They must have detected the crash signature." He turned to Sarah urgently. "You must understand, the Zephyrians value strength above all else. They believe the galaxy belongs to those with the highest classifications, an unclassified being." He didn't finish the sentence. The Zephyrian warriors arranged themselves in intimidating formation around Sarah and Voss's group. Their leader, distinguished by more elaborate armor and a weapon that seemed to be forged from some kind of exotic matter that bent light around it, stepped forward. Above his head, his system classification displayed proudly: X squared, X combatants, X squared, X odd, X squared, X squared, X squared. X squared, X squared. Where Voss's people were tall and graceful, Krath was massive and imposing. Nearly 8 feet of dense muscle and bone, with skin like burnished bronze and eyes that glowed with inner fire. His armor looked like it had been forged in the heart of a star, and the weapon at his side hummed with barely contained energy. When he spoke, the universal translator rendered his words with the weight of absolute authority. "Keeper Voss, you will surrender the unclassified entity to Zephyrian custody immediately. By coalition law, unknown elements must be contained until proper classification can be determined." Voss's skin patterns flashed through what Sarah was beginning to recognize as diplomatic protests. "Warlord Krath. The being has done nothing to warrant detention. She claims to be a peaceful explorer from an unknown world." Krath's eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory intensity. "The system cannot classify her. She represents a potential threat to coalition security. Stand aside, Keeper." Sarah felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Everything about Krath's posture and tone suggested that he was used to being obeyed without question. The Zephyrian warriors behind him had their hands on their weapons, clearly prepared for violence if their warlord commanded it. But Sarah had not survived 3 years of deep space exploration, 2 equipment failures that should have been fatal, and a crash landing on an alien world just to be intimidated by someone whose entire identity seemed built around being classified as dangerous by a computer system. She stepped forward, placing herself between Voss and Krath. I appreciate the Keeper's protection, but I can speak for myself. She looked up at the towering warlord, meeting his burning gaze steadily. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, representing the human species of Earth. I'm a scientist and explorer, not a threat to anyone. If your coalition has procedures for first contact with new species, I'm prepared to follow them. Krath's expression shifted through what might have been surprise and amusement before settling on disdain. You dare address a warlord directly? Your system display shows no combat classification, no psionic rating, no technological achievements. You are nothing but an anomaly to be studied. The insult in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her temper begin to rise. She had spent her entire career fighting for recognition in a field dominated by men who assumed her gender made her less capable. She had earned her position aboard the Prometheus through pure merit, publishing papers that had revolutionized humanity's understanding of planetary formation. She had survived situations that would have killed people twice her size and half her age. She was not about to be dismissed by some alien bully with a superiority complex based on a computer's opinion of his combat rating. I'm not asking for your approval, warlord, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. I'm extending an offer of peaceful contact between our species. If you prefer to classify that as a threat rather than an opportunity, that says more about your limitations than mine. The silence that followed was profound. Voss's skin patterns had gone completely still, while the other crystalline collective members seemed frozen in shock. The Zephyrian warriors shifted uncertainly, clearly not accustomed to seeing anyone speak to their warlord in such terms. Krath himself stared down at Sarah for a long moment, his burning eyes processing this unexpected response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge that made the air itself seem to crackle with tension. Limitations? The word came out like a growl. You dare question the worth of a classification? You, who register as nothing in the system's eyes? He took a step closer, and Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body. Perhaps a demonstration is in order. Perhaps you need to understand your place in this galaxy before you can be properly contained. The warlord's hand moved to the exotic weapon at his side, and Sarah realized that her first contact with alien civilization was about to become something much more dangerous. But as she looked up at this towering warrior who seemed to measure everything by a system that valued only predetermined categories of strength, she found herself thinking about Earth's history, about every underdog who had ever faced impossible odds and won not through given advantages, but through determination, intelligence, and sheer human stubbornness. The system had tagged her as Earthborn Canon, and now she was beginning to understand why that might be the most dangerous classification of all. Warlord Krath drew his weapon with the fluid motion of someone who had performed the action thousands of times. The blade that emerged from its exotic matter sheath was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It seemed to be forged from crystallized starlight itself, its edge so fine that it made the air around it shimmer and warp. According to her tablet's emergency database, such weapons were theoretical impossibilities, requiring matter compressed under pressures that existed only in neutron stars. This blade, Krath announced, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, was forged from the core of a dead star. It has cleaved through battleship hulls, parted molecular bonds themselves. It has never failed to cut through anything I have wished to destroy. He held the weapon aloft, and Sarah could see space itself bending slightly around its edge. It represents the pinnacle of Zephyrian craftsmanship, wielded by one who has achieved the highest possible combat classification. The crystalline collective had backed away to what they clearly considered a safe distance. Voss's skin patterns were flashing in rapid sequences that Sarah's growing familiarity with their communication suggested was either prayer or panic. The Zephyrian warriors had formed a circle around the confrontation, their own weapons drawn but held at ready rather than aimed. This was their warlord's moment. Dara looked at the impossible blade, then at the 8-foot warrior who wielded it with casual ease, then at the various alien spectators who were clearly expecting to witness her immediate and messy demise. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in scientific method and careful analysis, was screaming that she should surrender immediately, accept whatever detention Krath offered, and hope that diplomacy might eventually resolve the situation. But Sarah had not become the youngest person ever to lead a deep space geological survey by being rational, when rationality meant accepting limitations others imposed on her. Impressive, she said, studying the weapon with the same clinical detachment she might use to examine an interesting rock formation. The engineering required to maintain molecular stability at that compression level must be extraordinary. Though I noticed the energy field extending about 3 millimeters beyond the apparent blade edge, That suggests the cutting mechanism relies on spatial distortion rather than actual molecular shearing, doesn't it? Krath's expression shifted from ceremonial pride to genuine confusion. You analyze my weapon, rather than fear it? Sarah shrugged. I'm a scientist. Everything is interesting from an analytical perspective. She looked up at him calmly, though I'm curious about something. You keep talking about your classifications and your system ratings as if they define your capabilities, but what did you do before the system told you what you were capable of? The question seemed to strike the warlord like a physical blow. His burning eyes narrowed, and the heat radiating from his body increased noticeably. The system has existed for 3 millennia. It is the foundation of all civilized society. It determines worth, capability, destiny. But somebody had to build it, right? Sarah pressed. Somebody had to decide what categories mattered, what measurements were important. Who made those choices? Voss's skin patterns had shifted to what looked like fascination mixed with terror. The other aliens, both Crystalline Collective and Zephyrian, were listening with expressions that suggested they had never heard anyone question the fundamental assumptions of their society. Krath's grip on his weapon tightened. The system evolved beyond its creators. It became objective, perfect, incapable of error or bias. It sees truth that limited beings cannot perceive. And yet it can't classify me, Sarah pointed out. So either it's not as perfect as you think, or, she paused, letting the implication hang in the air, or maybe some things don't fit into predetermined categories. The warlord raised his blade, its impossible edge catching the light of the alien suns and fracturing it into spectrum patterns that hurt to look at directly. Enough philosophy. You will submit to Zephyrian authority, or you will be cut down where you stand. These are your only options. Sarah looked at the weapon that could allegedly cut through battleship hulls, held by a warrior whose system classification marked him as one of the most dangerous beings in known space. She thought about her crash-landed escape pod, her failed communications equipment, her complete lack of backup or support. She thought about Earth, impossibly distant, and how no one there would ever know what had happened to humanity's first contact with alien civilization. Then she thought about her grandmother who had fled war-torn China with nothing but determination and the clothes on her back, eventually building a successful life in a country where she didn't speak the language. She thought about her mother, who had become a surgeon despite growing up in poverty and facing discrimination at every level of her education. She thought about herself, standing in the geology department at MIT at age 16, being told she was too young, too small, too female to lead dangerous expeditions into space. Every generation of her family had faced people who tried to define them by categories they hadn't chosen. Every generation had proven that human beings didn't fit neatly into anyone else's predetermined limitations. You're right, Sarah said finally. Those are my only options according to your system. She took a step closer to the towering warrior, close enough that the heat from his body made her skin prickle. But I'm not part of your system, am I? I'm something it can't understand or categorize. So maybe I have options you haven't considered. Krath's eyes widened slightly at her approach. In his experience, beings faced with the Starforged blade either cowered in terror or attacked in desperate fury. This calm, analytical approach was entirely outside his understanding. You speak as if being unclassified grants you some advantage, he growled, but it merely means the system cannot determine your worth. It does not make you powerful. Sarah smiled, and there was something in that expression that made several of the watching aliens take involuntary steps backward. You're making an assumption that power is something the system can measure. But what if the most dangerous things in the universe are the ones that don't fit into categories? She gestured toward his weapon. That blade is certainly impressive, forged from stellar matter capable of cutting through molecular bonds. But it's still just a tool that does what tools do, cut things according to predictable physical laws. It works because the universe follows rules, because matter behaves in consistent ways. Krath's confusion was deepening, but his grip on the weapon remained steady. Your point? My point, Sarah said, is that everything in your galaxy seems to be designed around predictability. Your system classifies beings based on measurable parameters. Your weapons work according to known physical principles. Your entire civilization is built on the idea that everything can be understood, categorized, and controlled. She spread her arms wide, encompassing the alien landscape around them. But I come from a world that never had that luxury. Earth doesn't give its children cosmic classifications or guaranteed outcomes. We learn to survive not by fitting into categories, but by refusing to accept that any limitation was permanent. The warlord's patience was clearly wearing thin. Your philosophy will not protect you from stellar matter, human. Sarah nodded agreeably. You're absolutely right. Philosophy is useless against superior technology and overwhelming force. Good thing I'm not planning to rely on philosophy. Before anyone could react, she moved. Sarah had practiced martial arts since childhood. Not the theatrical combat sports popular on Earth, but practical systems designed for real-world self-defense. Her instructors had been military veterans and law enforcement officers who taught her that the first rule of survival was never to fight fair when your life was on the line. But more importantly, she had spent 3 years in zero-gravity and low-gravity environments, learning to move and react in conditions that would have crippled most Earthborn humans. She had developed reflexes and spatial awareness that came from living in an environment where a single mistake could mean explosive decompression and death. The watching aliens saw her step forward and reach out as if to touch the star-forged blade. What they didn't see was the subtle shift in her stance, the way she angled her approach to maximize leverage while minimizing her exposure to the weapon's cutting edge. Kraft saw a small, unclassified being apparently committing suicide by attacking a weapon that could cut through battleship armor. He was so stunned by the apparent madness of her action that he hesitated for a crucial fraction of a second before beginning his own attack. That hesitation was all Sarah needed. Her fingers made contact with the flat of the blade just below the energy field that extended from its edge. The exotic matter felt strange under her touch, warm and somehow alive, vibrating at frequencies she could feel in her bones. But exotic matter, no matter how impossibly compressed, still followed certain physical laws. It still had mass, momentum, and inertia, and Sarah had learned long ago that you didn't need to be stronger than your opponent if you were smarter about leverage and physics. She twisted her body in a motion that would have been impossible for someone who hadn't spent years moving in zero gravity, using Kraft's own forward momentum against him while applying pressure at precisely the right angle to redirect the blade's path. Instead of cutting through her throat, the impossible weapon swept harmlessly past her shoulder. But Sarah wasn't finished. As the blade passed by her, she continued her motion, stepping inside Kraft's guard and placing her other hand against his wrist. The warlord was immensely strong, but strength was useless if he couldn't apply it effectively. Sarah's position made it impossible for him to bring the weapon back around without striking himself, while her grip on his wrist controlled the weapon's point of articulation. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two of them stood frozen in tableau. The massive Zephyrian warrior and the small human woman, their positions a perfect demonstration of how technique could overcome raw power. Then Kraft tried to pull away, intending to reset the engagement and use his superior size and strength to overwhelm his opponent. But as he began to move, Sarah's grip shifted, and suddenly the warlord found himself unable to move his weapon arm at all. The watching aliens gasped in harmonics that needed no translation. Sarah had done something that should have been impossible according to everything they understood about combat, physics, and the natural order of the universe. She had stopped a Class A combat-rated warrior's attack with nothing but technique and timing. Kraft stared down at her in shock, his burning eyes wide with disbelief. "How?" he demanded. "The system rates me as maximally dangerous." "I have trained for centuries. I have never been defeated in single combat." Sarah maintained her grip on his wrist, keeping the stellar blade safely neutralized. "Maybe that's the problem. You've been training against opponents who fit into the same categories you do, people who fight the way the system expects them to fight." She applied a slight pressure to his wrist. Not enough to cause injury, but enough to demonstrate that she could dislocate his joint if she chose to. "I learned to fight on a world where survival meant adapting to whatever came at you, not relying on predetermined advantages. We call it thinking outside the box." The silence that followed was broken by Voss, whose skin patterns had shifted to something that looked like awe mixed with terror. She neutralized a warlord's attack. Without weapons, without armor, without any system classification at all. One of the Zephyrian warriors stepped forward, his own weapon drawn. "Warlord, shall we—" "No." Kraft's voice carried a strange note, something between respect and confusion. "This is unprecedented. The human defeated me through technique I have never encountered, using principles the system does not account for." Sarah released his wrist and stepped back, allowing the warlord to lower his weapon. "I didn't defeat you. I just showed you that your system might not account for everything." Kraft sheathed his star-forged blade, but his eyes remained fixed on Sarah with newfound intensity. "You speak truth, Earthborn. The system classified me based on my training, my weapons, my physical capabilities, but it did not account for opponents who fight with methods it cannot categorize." He straightened to his full, imposing height, but now his posture carried respect rather than threat. "I came here to detain an unclassified anomaly." Instead, I find myself confronted by something the Coalition has never encountered, a being who operates outside the system's ability to predict or control. Sarah nodded. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Maybe being unclassified isn't a weakness. Maybe it's the most dangerous thing of all. The implications of that statement were beginning to dawn on the assembled aliens. If the system could not predict or account for human capabilities, what did that mean for the Coalition's understanding of power and hierarchy? What did it mean for a civilization built on the foundation of technological classification and predetermined categories? Krath was the first to voice the question that was on everyone's mind. If you can neutralize a classic combat warrior without any system rating at all, what are the combat capabilities of your species? Sarah smiled, and once again, there was something in that expression that made the aliens uncomfortable. I'm not a warrior, Warlord. I'm a scientist who knows some self-defense. If you want to meet actual Earth warriors, she shrugged. Well, let's hope it never comes to that. The crystal sands around them seemed to vibrate with new harmonics as the full weight of her words sank in. The galaxy had just encountered its first human, and she had effortlessly demonstrated that everything they thought they knew about power and classification might be woefully inadequate. And this was just the beginning. The aftermath of Sarah's demonstration created a tension that seemed to make the very air of Kepler 442b thrum with uncertainty. Warlord Krath stood motionless, his massive frame radiating a heat that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the fundamental recalculation occurring in his mind. The crystalline collective maintained their distance, their bioluminescent patterns cycling through configurations that suggested they were engaging in rapid, complex communications among themselves. It was Voss who finally broke the silence, his musical voice carrying overtones of something that might have been reverence. In 3,000 years of system operation, this is the first time a being without classification has neutralized a phenomenon threat. The ramifications are staggering, finished Krath, his burning eyes still fixed on Sarah with laser focus. Everything the Coalition understands about power dynamics, about combat hierarchy, about the natural order of capabilities, all of it assumes the system can accurately measure and predict conflict outcomes. Sarah felt the weight of their attention and realized that her impulsive demonstration had created consequences far beyond what she had intended. She had acted on instinct, drawing on years of training and the fundamental human refusal to be intimidated, but now she was beginning to understand that her actions had implications that extended far beyond the single encounter. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should focus on the immediate situation. I'm stranded here, you're all trying to figure out what to do with me, and somewhere out there, my ship's emergency beacon might be drawing more attention than any of us want. Krath nodded slowly. The human speaks wisdom. Word of this encounter will spread rapidly through Coalition channels. When news reaches the Central Worlds that an unclassified being has demonstrated capabilities beyond system parameters, he paused, his expression darkening. There will be those who see this as a threat that must be eliminated, and others, Voss added, his skin patterns shifting to configurations Sarah was beginning to recognize as political concern, who will see opportunity for exploitation. An ally whose capabilities cannot be predicted or countered by enemies could shift the balance of power throughout the galaxy. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien planet's temperature. You're talking about turning me into a weapon, or making sure no one else can, Krath replied grimly. The Coalition maintains peace through predictable balance. When the Mindari developed new psionic techniques, the system classified and regulated them. When the Taurian collective created their hive mind networks, parameters were established to maintain equilibrium. But you, he gestured toward her with something approaching awe, you represent a variable the system cannot account for. The conversation was interrupted by a new harmonic vibration that seemed to come from the crystal spires themselves. Voss's skin patterns immediately shifted to alert configurations, while the Zephyrian warriors moved into defensive positions with practiced efficiency. Quantum communication pulse, Voss explained urgently. Someone is accessing the local network relay. Above them, the purple sky began to shimmer as if reality itself was being disturbed by some unseen force. The disturbance resolved into a massive holographic projection that dominated the horizon, a figure of imposing presence whose very appearance seemed to command attention and obedience. The being in the projection was unlike either the crystalline collective or the Zephyrians. It appeared to be composed of pure energy contained within a geometrically perfect humanoid framework, its form shifting through spectrums of light that suggested intelligence operating on levels beyond physical matter. When it spoke, its voice resonated not just through the air but seemed to vibrate through the quantum structure of space itself. I am Architect Prime Zeta, 7 of the Core Systems Authority, the projection announced, its words carrying the weight of absolute power. By emergency protocols, I am assuming direct oversight of the unclassified entity known as Sarah Chen. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Somehow, word of her existence had already reached whatever passed for the highest levels of this galactic government. The speed of that communication suggested a level of surveillance and information networks that was deeply unsettling. Krath immediately straightened into a formal military posture. Architect Prime, I am Warlord Krath of the 3rd Zephyrian Fleet. The entity has demonstrated capabilities that exceed system parameters for prediction and classification. Yes, the architect replied, its attention shifting to focus directly on Sarah, with an intensity that felt like being examined by a cosmic microscope. I have reviewed the preliminary data. An unclassified being neutralizing a tread represents a fundamental challenge to the stability of coalition society. Sarah stepped forward, refusing to be intimidated despite the overwhelming presence of the projection. With respect, Architect Prime, I haven't challenged anything except one individual's assumption that he could intimidate me into submission. I'm a peaceful explorer seeking diplomatic contact. The energy being's form pulsed with what might have been amusement. Dr. Sarah Chen, xenogeologist and senior researcher aboard the exploration vessel Prometheus. Your academic credentials are impressive but irrelevant to the current situation. You represent the first confirmation that intelligent life exists beyond coalition space, and your capabilities cannot be measured or predicted by our foundational technologies. Your foundational technologies, Sarah said, might be the problem. Any system that reduces beings to simple categories is going to miss important variables. The silence that followed her statement was profound. Even the ambient harmonics from the crystal spires seemed to pause, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Explain. The architect commanded, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested genuine interest rather than mere authority. Sarah took a deep breath, realizing that she was about to attempt something that could determine the future relationship between humanity and this vast galactic civilization. Your system classifies beings based on measurable parameters: combat ability, psionic potential, technological achievement. But those are just outputs, not the fundamental drivers of capability.
She gestured towards Krath.
The Warlord is classified as paper based on his training, his weapons, his physical abilities. But what happens when he encounters something that operates according to different principles? What happens when raw capability meets adaptive intelligence? The architect's form shifted through several spectrum configurations before responding. You suggest that the system's analytical framework is incomplete? I suggest that any classification system that depends on predefined categories will inevitably encounter things that don't fit those categories, Sarah replied. On Earth, we have a saying, the map is not the territory. Your system might be an excellent map of known space, but I'm from territory that's not on your map. Voss's skin patterns were cycling through configurations that suggested he was processing implications far beyond the immediate conversation. If human capabilities cannot be predicted by the system, what does that mean for other aspects of your species? Technology, social organization, potential for expansion? Sarah felt the weight of the question. She was being asked to represent not just herself but all of humanity, to make decisions that would affect the future of both species. The responsibility was staggering. I can only speak for myself, she said carefully, but humans tend to approach problems through adaptation rather than classification. We're not particularly strong or fast compared to some species on our own planet, but we're very good at figuring out solutions when our survival depends on it. Krath spoke up, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. The human demonstrated this adaptation in combat. She used principles I had never encountered, techniques the system had never recorded. If this represents typical human capability, then the coalition faces a choice, the architect finished. Integration or isolation. Alliance or containment. The holographic projection expanded, showing star charts that encompassed vast regions of space. Sarah could see trade routes, territorial boundaries, fleet positions, a visualization of galactic civilization that took her breath away. And there, at the very edge of the display, was a small indicator marking the approximate location of Earth. Your species occupies a single world at the periphery of known space, the architect continued. By all conventional measurements, you should represent no significant factor in galactic politics. But if your capabilities cannot be predicted or countered by existing technologies, your potential influence is incalculable. Sarah studied the display, noting how Earth's location placed it at a critical junction between several major territorial boundaries. Even without advanced technology, a species that couldn't be classified or predicted could become a wild card that disrupted carefully maintained balances of power. "What are you proposing?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Containment," the architect replied without hesitation. "Your species will be quarantined within your home system until proper classification protocols can be developed. In the interim, you will remain in core systems custody for study and analysis." The casual way the architect discussed imprisoning her entire species sent a surge of anger through Sarah that she struggled to control. The diplomatic part of her mind recognized that from the Coalition's perspective, quarantining an unknown threat made tactical sense. But the human part of her mind, the part that had inherited generations of resistance to being categorized and controlled by others, rebelled against the entire concept. "And if we refuse?" she asked quietly. The architect's form pulsed with what was unmistakably threat. "Refusal would constitute confirmation that your species represents a hostile force. Appropriate measures would be taken to ensure Coalition security." Sarah felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. The wrong response could doom humanity to eternal quarantine, or worse. But the right response, if such a thing existed, required her to navigate political and military complexities for which her academic training had never prepared her. She thought about Earth, about the billions of people going about their daily lives with no knowledge that their entire future was being decided by a conversation on an alien world. She thought about humanity's long history of refusing to accept limitations imposed by others, and about the price that resistance had sometimes demanded. "Architect Prime," she said finally, "with respect, you're making the same mistake that every powerful civilization in history has made when encountering something they couldn't understand or control." "Which is?" "You're assuming that force is the solution to uncertainty." Sarah met the projection's intense gaze steadily. "But uncertainty isn't a problem to be solved. It's the natural state of a universe too complex for any system to fully comprehend. And trying to eliminate uncertainty through force usually creates more problems than it solves. The energy being's form shifted through several configurations before settling into what might have been consideration." "You propose an alternative?" "I propose that instead of trying to classify or contain what you don't understand, you try to understand what you don't classify." Sarah gestured toward the assembled aliens around her. "Look what happened here. Warlord Krath came to detain me based on system protocols. Instead, we ended up having a conversation that revealed limitations in how the Coalition approaches power and capability." She turned to address Kraft directly. "You learned something today about combat that your system had never taught you. Was that knowledge dangerous or valuable?" The warlord considered the question with obvious care. "Valuable," he admitted. "Understanding weaknesses in my combat doctrine makes me more effective, not less." "Exactly," Sarah said, turning back to the architect. "What if instead of quarantining my species, you invited us to participate in exchanges that benefit everyone? What if the fact that we operate outside your classifications makes us useful partners rather than threats to be contained?" The projection expanded again, showing detailed analyses of resource distributions, technological capabilities throughout Coalition space. Sarah could see the careful balance that maintained stability across hundreds of worlds and dozens of species. "Your proposal has merit," the architect acknowledged, "but it also carries unprecedented risks. If human capabilities prove hostile, the damage could be catastrophic before containment measures could be implemented. And if our capabilities prove beneficial, the advantages could be equally significant," Sarah countered. "Besides, you're operating under the assumption that containment is actually possible. What if it's not?" That question seemed to resonate through the projection with particular force. "Explain." Sarah smiled, and once again there was something in that expression that made even the energy being's perfect geometric form flicker with what might have been unease. "You've already admitted that your system can't classify or predict human capabilities. How can you be certain that quarantine measures designed according to system parameters would actually contain us?" The silence that followed stretched for long moments while the implications of her words sank in. "If the Coalition's foundational technology couldn't measure or predict human capabilities, how could it design effective countermeasures?" "You suggest that attempted containment might itself prove impossible," the architect said slowly. "I suggest that the most dangerous response to encountering something unpredictable is to try to control it through methods that depend on prediction," Sarah replied. "Sometimes the only safe course is cooperation." The alien suns were setting, painting the crystal landscape in shades of amber and rose. In the gathering twilight, the bioluminescent patterns of the coral spires began to pulse with greater intensity, creating a backdrop of organic beauty that made the political tensions seem almost surreal. But the conversation that was taking place on this distant world would determine the relationship between humanity and galactic civilization for generations to come. And Sarah Chen, stranded xenogeologist, found herself serving as both ambassador and advocate for a species that had never known they needed either. The debate that followed Sarah's challenge stretched through the alien night as multiple coalition authorities joined the quantum communication network. The crystal spires around them pulsed with increased intensity as data streams flowed through the planetary communication grid, creating a light show that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Architect Prime Zeta 7 had been joined by representatives from a dozen major coalition powers, their holographic forms arranged in a circle around the crash site like judges in a cosmic tribunal. Sarah found herself at the center of attention from beings who collectively governed hundreds of worlds and trillions of sentient creatures. There was Admiral Nexus of the Coalition Defense Fleet, whose cybernetic enhancements allowed him to interface directly with ship-class weapon systems. His strategic classification made him one of the few beings in the galaxy qualified to assess military threats on an interstellar scale. Beside him stood Counselor Miranda of the Mindari Collective, her translucent form radiating the psychic energy that had earned her a... Her species had evolved beyond individual consciousness centuries ago, operating as a networked intelligence that could process information at quantum speeds. The most unsettling presence belonged to Judge Construct Omega. 1, 2, a being that had transcended biological form entirely to become something between artificial intelligence and cosmic force of nature. Its technological classification indicated capabilities that approached godlike levels of computational power. Each of these beings represented the absolute pinnacle of their respective categories within the system's hierarchy. Collectively, they possessed enough power to reshape star systems or eliminate entire species. And they were all focused on determining what to do with one human xenogeologist who had committed the crime of being unclassifiable. The strategic implications are clear, Admiral Nexus was saying, his cybernetic voice carrying the weight of military analysis. An unknown species with unpredictable capabilities represents an unacceptable variable in fleet deployment calculations. Quarantine protocols must be implemented immediately. Counselor Mirana's response carried harmonics of psychic communication that Sarah could feel like whispers at the edge of consciousness. The Mindari Collective has attempted to parse the human's mental patterns. Her thoughts operate according to frameworks we cannot fully comprehend. This suggests cognitive processes that exist outside psionic classification parameters. Fascinating, added Judge Construct Omega. 1, 2, its voice carrying mathematical precision that made each word feel like a logical proof. Analysis of her combat demonstration reveals tactical applications of physics principles not currently included in coalition military doctrine. If this represents standard human knowledge, their technological development path may be fundamentally different from any known species. Sarah listened to the debate with growing unease. These beings were discussing humanity as if they were analyzing a potential plague outbreak, calculating threats and benefits with cold efficiency. The fact that her demonstration had impressed them only seemed to make them more determined to either control or eliminate the potential threat her species represented. "You're still thinking about this wrong," she interrupted, drawing surprised attention from the assembled powers. "You're trying to fit humanity into your existing frameworks just with different variables. But what if the real difference isn't in what we can do, but in how we think about problems?" Architect Prime's energy form pulsed with what might have been impatience. "Elaborate." Sarah gestured toward the coalition representatives. "Each of you represents the highest possible achievement within your classification category. You've reached the peak of what the system considers possible for your types of intelligence and capability, but what happens when you encounter a problem that can't be solved within your existing categories?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Finally, it was Counselor Mirana who responded, her psychic harmonics carrying undertones of unease. "The system accounts for all known categories of challenge and solution. Unprecedented problems require coordination between multiple classification types." "Exactly," Sarah said. "When you face something new, you form committees of specialists and try to combine your different approaches. But what if the solution requires thinking that doesn't fit into any of your specialist categories?" Judge Construct Omega 1, 2 processed this for several computational cycles before responding. "You suggest that human problem-solving operates outside categorical frameworks entirely. I suggest that humans never had the luxury of categorical frameworks," Sarah replied. "We evolved on a world where survival meant adapting to whatever conditions we encountered, not optimizing for predetermined parameters." To demonstrate her point, She picked up a fragment of crystalline sand from the ground around her feet. Under the light of the alien suns, the crystal threw rainbow patterns across her palm. This crystal is beautiful and geometrically perfect. It probably forms according to very specific chemical and environmental conditions. But if those conditions change, she applied pressure to the crystal with her thumb until it cracked. It breaks. She poured the crystal fragments from one hand to the other. Humans are more like water. We don't have a perfect form, but we adapt to whatever container we're placed in. Change the conditions, and we change with them. Admiral Nexus leaned forward, his cybernetic enhancements whirring with analysis. You claim adaptive capability as a strategic advantage? I claim adaptive capability as a survival necessity, Sarah corrected. We never became specialists because specialization was a luxury we couldn't afford. Every human has to be part warrior, part diplomat, part scientist, part philosopher, because we never knew which combination of skills we'd need to survive. The debate that followed revealed fundamental differences in how the coalition powers approached the concept of capability itself. To them, advancement meant optimization within specific categories, becoming the best possible warrior, the most powerful psychic, the most advanced technological entity. The idea of maintaining broad adaptability rather than narrow specialization was alien to their thinking. Your approach suggests inherent inefficiency, Architect Prime observed. Specialization allows for maximum development of specific capabilities. Why would any species choose to remain generalists? Because sometimes the most efficient solution isn't the most effective one, Sarah replied. And because we learned that the universe doesn't care about our plans or our specializations. It's going to throw problems at us that we've never seen before, and when that happens, adaptability matters more than optimization. As if summoned by her words, the crystal spires around them began to emit new harmonic frequencies, deeper, more ominous tones that made the ground itself vibrate. The coalition representatives' holographic forms flickered as whatever communication network they were using registered some kind of interference. Voss's skin patterns shifted to configurations that Sarah had learned indicated extreme alarm. Emergency quantum cascade detected. Something is destabilizing the local space-time matrix. Admiral Nexus's cybernetic systems immediately began processing threat assessments. Unknown vessels approaching at translight velocities, configuration does not match any coalition designs. Above them, the purple sky began to crack like broken glass, revealing glimpses of something vast and metallic moving through the quantum foam between dimensions. Sarah's tablet began registering energy signatures that shouldn't exist according to human understanding of physics. The Devourers whispered Counselor Nirana, her psychic harmonics carrying overtones of pure terror. They have found the system. Sarah had never heard the term before, but the way it affected the coalition representatives told her everything she needed to know. These were beings that made even the galaxy's most powerful entities afraid. Who are the Devourers? She asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. It was Judge Construct Omega. Two who responded, its mathematical precision now carrying undertones of something that might have been dread, entities from outside known space. They consume entire systems, converting matter and energy into forms that exist outside normal dimensional parameters. The Coalition has fought 3 wars against them. Each encounter resulted in the complete loss of multiple star systems. The cracks in the sky widened, revealing glimpses of ships that hurt to look at directly, vessels whose geometry seemed to fold in on itself in ways that made Sarah's eyes water. The Devourer's technology operated according to principles that violated basic assumptions about how reality functioned. They cannot be negotiated with, Admiral Nexus added, his weapon systems automatically cycling through threat assessments. They cannot be deterred. Every coalition engagement has ended in either complete victory or total annihilation of our forces. Warlord Krath, who had remained silent during the political discussions, stepped forward with his star-forged blade already in hand. How many ships? Preliminary scans indicate a harvesting fleet, the Admiral replied grimly. 17 primary vessels, each capable of sterilizing continental landmasses. Standard coalition protocol requires immediate evacuation of all inhabited systems in their projected path. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien night air. And you're all here discussing what to do with me while this is happening? Architect Prime's energy form pulsed with what might have been defensive programming. The Devourer incursion was not predicted by any early warning systems. Their arrival appears to be coincidental with your crash landing. But even as the words formed, Sarah could see doubt creeping into the coalition representatives' expressions. The timing was too convenient, the confluence of events too precise to be mere coincidence. Unless, she said slowly, They were drawn here by something they detected, something that doesn't fit into normal space-time parameters. The silence that followed was profound. Every eye, biological, cybernetic, and energy-based, focused on Sarah with dawning realization. "The system malfunctioned," Counselor Marana whispered. "When it encountered the human, it generated classification errors that propagated through the quantum information matrix. If the Devourers monitor for anomalies in dimensional stability, Judge Construct Omega, 1, 2, completed the logical progression with mathematical certainty. They were drawn here by the same unclassifiable nature that makes Dr. Chen unpredictable to coalition systems." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical force. Her presence hadn't just created political complications, it had potentially doomed an entire world. But as she looked up at the alien ships tearing through reality above them, she found herself thinking about human history, and all the times her species had faced impossible odds. They had survived ice ages and asteroid impacts, plagues and wars, natural disasters, and their own stupidity. Each time they had adapted, improvised, and found ways to turn apparent disadvantages into unexpected strengths. "So," she said, her voice carrying a calm that surprised even her, "we have hostile aliens with technology that violates known physics, coming to destroy everything in the system because my existence broke your computer, and your standard response is evacuation." Admiral Nexus nodded grimly. "Evacuation of all possible assets, followed by strategic withdrawal until sufficient coalition forces can be assembled for counterattack." Sarah looked around at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization beings with classifications that marked them as the most capable entities in known space, and realized that for all their power and advanced technology, they were thinking about the problem in exactly the same way every other military organization in history had approached overwhelming force: run away, regroup, come back with bigger guns. It was a perfectly logical response according to every military doctrine she had ever studied. It was also exactly the kind of categorical thinking that humans had learned to avoid. "What if," Sarah said quietly, "instead of running away, we try something they won't expect?" The coalition representatives stared at her as if she had suggested something not just impossible, but insane. "Dr. Chen," Architect Prime said with mathematical precision, "the Devourers have conquered 3 separate coalition fleets. They possess technology that operates outside known physical laws. Any attempted engagement would result in complete annihilation." Sarah smiled, and once again there was something in that expression that made even cosmic entities uncomfortable. "Good," she said. "That means they won't be expecting it." The plan that Sarah proposed over the next hour was so audacious that it left the assembled coalition powers in various states of shock, disbelief, and what might charitably be called terrified fascination. It violated every principle of military engagement, ignored basic assumptions about technological superiority, and depended on variables that couldn't be calculated or predicted. In other words, it was exactly the kind of plan that humans had been using to survive impossible situations for thousands of years. "You want to surrender?" Admiral Nexus asked, his cybernetic voice processing disbelief through multiple computational filters. "To beings that have never accepted surrender in 3 wars spanning centuries?" Sarah shook her head. "I want to do something they've never encountered before, something so far outside their operational parameters that they won't know how to respond." She gestured toward the cracks in the sky, through which glimpses of the Devourer fleet continued to emerge from whatever dimension they used for faster-than-light travel. "You said they consume matter and energy, converting it into forms that exist outside normal dimensional parameters. But what if we give them something they can't convert?" Counselor Marana's psychic harmonics carried overtones of confusion. "Nothing exists that cannot be consumed by Devourer technology. They have devoured entire star systems, including spatial anomalies and dimensional rifts. But they've never tried to consume something that doesn't fit into any classification system," Sarah pointed out. "Something that exists outside categorical frameworks entirely. Judge Construct Omega." 1-2 processed this for several computational cycles before responding. "You propose using your unclassifiable nature as a weapon?" "I propose using it as a puzzle," Sarah corrected. "Think about it from their perspective. They've spent centuries perfecting conversion technologies that work on everything they've encountered. Their entire strategic doctrine depends on being able to process whatever they find into usable resources. But what happens when they encounter something their systems can't parse?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Warlord Krath, who had been studying the alien ships with professional military attention, lowered his star-forged blade and turned to Sarah with something approaching awe. "They would attempt analysis," he said slowly. Any military force encountering an unknown variable would pause to assess potential threats and opportunities. Exactly, Sarah said. And during that assessment period, they'd be vulnerable in ways they've never been vulnerable before. Not to superior firepower or advanced technology, but to simple confusion. Architect Prime's energy form pulsed through several spectrum configurations before settling into what might have been reluctant interest. Your strategy depends on creating hesitation in entities that have never demonstrated hesitation. My strategy depends on being something they've never encountered before, Sarah replied, which, according to your own system, is exactly what I am. The debate that followed was unlike anything in Coalition history. Military commanders, scientific entities, and political leaders found themselves discussing tactical applications of categorical uncertainty, strategic implications of unclassifiable variables, and combat doctrines based on adaptive improvisation rather than predetermined parameters. But time was running out. The Devourer fleet had completed its dimensional transition and was now moving through normal space toward Kepler 442b. Admiral Nexus's sensors indicated that their approach pattern was consistent with resource assessment protocols. They were analyzing the system's contents before beginning consumption operations. Preliminary scans show 17 primary vessels as originally detected, the Admiral reported, but each ship appears to be reconfiguring itself based on local resource availability. They're adapting their consumption technology to maximize efficiency for this specific system. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. They're doing exactly what you do. Analyzing, categorizing, optimizing based on known parameters. Which means they're thinking about this system the same way the Coalition thinks about everything else. She turned to address the assembled representatives. How long do we have before they begin actual consumption? Based on previous engagement patterns, approximately 47 minutes. Judge Construct Omega 1-2 calculated with mathematical precision. 47 minutes to implement a plan that had never been tried, using principles that couldn't be measured, against enemies that had never been defeated. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility for an entire world, but also something else, the familiar sensation of facing impossible odds that had driven human innovation for millennia. All right, she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had made peace with the possibility of failure. Here's what we're going to do. The implementation of Sarah's plan required coordination between Coalition forces in ways that had never been attempted before. Instead of optimizing each ship and crew for specific tactical roles, she insisted that they randomize assignments, mix specialization categories, and deliberately introduce elements of unpredictability into their formations. You want our Class A pilots flying science vessels? Admiral Nexus asked, his processing systems clearly struggling with the concept. I want your Class A pilots learning to think like scientists while your scientists learn to fight like warriors, Sarah replied. I want every ship in your fleet to be something the Devourers can't classify or predict. Warlord Kraft understood immediately. Adaptive formations. Instead of maintaining optimal tactical configurations, we maintain optimal flexibility. Exactly. When the Devourers scan your fleet, they should see chaos where they expect order, improvisation where they expect optimization. Counselor Morana's psychic harmonics carried overtones of theoretical excitement mixed with practical terror. The psychological implications are staggering. But if the Devourers' tactical systems depend on predicting enemy behavior based on classification categories, then we make ourselves unclassifiable, Sarah finished, just like humanity has always been. The next 30 minutes transformed the Coalition response from a standard military evacuation into something that resembled controlled chaos. Ships designed for specific purposes were retrofitted with equipment from entirely different specializations. Science vessels mounted weapon systems, while warships carried research equipment. Mixed crews operated according to improvised protocols that violated every principle of efficient command structure. To outside observers, it looked like a fleet in complete disarray. But Sarah recognized something in the organized confusion that reminded her of humanity's greatest achievements, the kind of creative problem-solving that emerged when survival depended on using whatever tools were available rather than the tools that were supposed to work. The Devourer response was everything she had hoped for and feared. As the alien fleet approached Kepler 442b, their scanning systems encountered Coalition forces that didn't fit any known tactical categories. Ships that registered as science vessels maneuvered like fighters. Research stations broadcast military encryption protocols. Individual crew members carried equipment combinations that violated all known specialization principles. For the first time in recorded history, a Devourer fleet hesitated. The pause lasted only minutes, but those minutes were crucial. Instead of beginning immediate consumption operations, the alien ships moved into analysis formation, their exotic technology probing and scanning in an attempt to categorize what they were encountering. "It's working," Admiral Nexus reported, his cybernetic voice carrying disbelief. "They've shifted from assault configuration to assessment mode. Unknown scan frequencies detected. They're trying to classify our fleet composition." Sarah felt a moment of fierce satisfaction, but she knew the real test was yet to come. Making the Devourers pause was only the first step. Now came the part that would determine whether her plan was brilliant or suicidal. "All ships implement Protocol Chaos," she commanded, using the designation they had agreed upon for the next phase. Across the Coalition fleet, every principle of military organization was deliberately violated. Ships broke formation randomly, individual commanders made independent tactical decisions without coordination, and crew members began operating according to completely improvised procedures. To any military observer, it would have looked like total collapse of command structure. But to Sarah, it looked like the most human response possible to an impossible situation. Everyone working together by working alone, achieving coordination through the shared commitment to adaptive improvisation. The Devourer fleet's response was immediate and profound. Their scanning systems, designed to analyze and predict based on observable patterns, encountered a tactical situation that had no patterns to analyze. Every ship in the Coalition fleet was doing something different, something unpredictable, something that couldn't be categorized or countered by predetermined responses. For beings who had spent centuries perfecting the art of consuming everything they encountered, the experience of finding something that couldn't be consumed was fundamentally disorienting. "Devourer fleet is stopping," Admiral Nexus reported, his voice carrying amazement. "All 17 ships have ceased forward movement. Unknown energy signatures detected. Their conversion systems appear to be cycling through diagnostic routines." Sarah nodded grimly. "They're trying to figure out what we are before they decide how to consume us. The problem is, we're not anything they can figure out." But she knew the pause wouldn't last forever. Eventually, the Devourers would either solve the puzzle or decide to destroy what they couldn't understand. The window of opportunity was narrow and closing rapidly. "Phase 2, she announced. "Time for the real gamble." What followed was perhaps the most audacious military maneuver in galactic history. Instead of using their temporary advantage to attack or escape, the Coalition fleet began broadcasting on every possible frequency. Not weapons targeting data or tactical communications, but pure information. They transmitted poetry and mathematical theorems, philosophical arguments, and engineering specifications. They flooded the quantum communication spectrum with the unorganized, uncategorized, gloriously chaotic output of dozens of different species thinking about hundreds of different problems in thousands of different ways. "What are we doing?" Counselor Mirana asked, her psychic harmonics carrying overtones of confusion. "We're showing them what unclassifiable actually means," Sarah replied. "We're giving them so much variety, so much complexity, so much sheer adaptability that their systems can't process it all." The effect on the Devourer fleet was immediate and catastrophic. Ships that had conquered star systems began to shudder as their conversion technologies tried to parse and categorize information that had no category. Their exotic matter hulls flickered between dimensions as processing systems designed for consuming orderly matter encountered the fundamental disorder of consciousness itself. One by one, the Devourer ships began to retreat. Not destroyed, not defeated in the traditional sense, but overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of classifying what they had encountered. Their entire operational framework depended on being able to analyze, categorize, and consume. When faced with something that couldn't be analyzed or categorized, they had no choice but to withdraw. As the last of the alien ships disappeared into whatever dimension they used for faster-than-light travel, the assembled Coalition forces found themselves floating in space around Kepler 442b, staring at each other in amazement. "Did we just win?" Warlord Krath asked, his voice carrying disbelief. "We didn't win," Sarah replied, watching the quantum disturbances fade as normal space-time reasserted itself. "We survived. And sometimes, that's more important." The aftermath of the Devourer encounter changed everything about how the Coalition approached the concept of classification and categorical thinking. For the first time in 3,000 years, they had encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through optimization and specialization. They had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to overwhelming force was not more force, but more confusion. That adaptability could triumph over optimization, and that being unclassifiable might be the most valuable classification of all. As for Sarah Chen, stranded xenogeologist who had accidentally become humanity's first ambassador to galactic civilization, She found herself facing a choice that would determine the future relationship between Earth and the stars. The Coalition Council extends an invitation, Architect Prime announced, its energy form pulsing with something that might have been respect. Humanity will be granted full membership status, with Earth designated as a free adaptation zone, a world where beings can learn to operate outside categorical constraints. Sarah looked up at the stars, thinking about her home world and all the people who had no idea their entire future had just been decided on an alien planet. She thought about the crash that had brought her here, the confrontation that had revealed humanity's nature, and the impossible battle they had somehow won. "I accept," she said simply. "On one condition?" "Which is?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time since landing on Kepler, 442b. It was a smile of pure joy rather than determined defiance. "No one gets to classify us. Ever. We remain what we've always been, something that doesn't fit into anyone else's categories, something that adapts instead of optimizing, something that survives by refusing to accept limitations." She gestured toward the stars, toward the vast galaxy that had just learned that the most dangerous beings in the universe might be those who had never needed to be dangerous in the first place. "We're human. The system, for its part, processed this declaration and did something unprecedented in its 3,000-year history. It updated its classification of humanity to read, "Underdatable," and then, in a footnote that would become legendary throughout Coalition space, it added a single word that captured everything the galaxy had learned about Earth's children: